Welcome back to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, Jed Lea-Henry. And on today's show, we have Terence Roehrig, Professor of National Security Affairs at the US Naval War College, the author of a number of interesting books, which I have read myself and will link below, and a previous guest on the podcast on two separate occasions. First time we spoke about the US nuclear umbrella. And on the second occasion, we spoke about a topic which will be quite interesting for today's topic. I will encourage listeners to go and listen to that beforehand as well. And that is a discussion we had on the Northern Limit Line, the maritime boundary between North and South Korea. Terence, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you, Jed. Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to speak about Korea as a maritime nation and all the interesting things that come around with that. But at first, I do know you want to get in a caveat about these views being your own, and just in case people try to extrapolate them.
Yes, I do have to say that these are my own personal views and do not represent those of the U.S. Navy, the U.S. government, or the Department of Defense.
So with that out of the way, let's jump into the content itself. And this is really quite an interesting topic. And the thing and the place where I'm going to start is a place where you start in one of your articles. And that is the question and the issue where you say that the maritime questions around South Korea is largely overlooked or have been largely overlooked. And this is quite a strange topic. So as a very brief overview, let's start there. What are the important maritime issues covering South Korea, and why do they tend to be overlooked in such significant ways?
Well, and I think you have to go back to the Korean War and North-South security issues, that was largely a land-based conflict, land-based concerns. The U.S. Navy tended to take care of most of the maritime issues. The North Korean Navy was not of much concern in those early days. But that has changed. And so I think there are a number of different reasons why the maritime domain for Korean security and for Korean interests writ large have become much more important. Let me start first with the economic side of this. As the South Korean economy took off in the 70s and 80s, very clearly an export-driven economy, and those exports heavily dependent on ocean-borne commerce. And so the importance of safe and secure sea lanes were very important for South Korea. So you have those economic interests that are essential to South Korean economic growth. On a security side, I think you started to have the concern with North Korea evolve and grow. North Korea developed a submarine fleet that, while a lot of its boats are older models, the sinking of the Chonan in 2010 showed how the anti-submarine warfare mission was one that was very important for South Korean security. Before that, there were a number of clashes along the Northern Limit Line that pointed to maritime security. But beyond that, there are also continuing concerns about Chinese maritime growth and naval growth, and how South Korea can, in some way, try to address the concerns that it may have in that regard. It also has an island dispute with Japan that Koreans are very passionate about and feel that they need to protect and make sure that they can protect, even though the likelihood of Japan doing anything by force to deal with that island dispute, I think, is almost zero. But nonetheless, South Korea is still concerned about that. And again, when you just look at the geography of South Korea, if you consider the DMZ as a very hard border, in many respects, South Korea is an island, as the bottom half of the peninsula. And so that it is a maritime nation with a lot of important economic interests, shipping, also fishing, but also security interests that come along with that. It is not a surprise that South Korea should be considered and has begun to work on its capabilities to maintain and grow itself as a maritime state.
So let's launch into one of the most significant challenges, and that is China. We're going to build up towards Japan, as you mentioned, and most people find that the most interesting. So we will leave that one for last. But let's start with China. And as you write, South Korea's trade with China, I think, is more than South Korea's trade with the United States and Japan combined. So as this goes to what you mentioned there about the important economic interests around this maritime border, but it seems to be that a significant unresolved challenge remains there, and that is this demarcation line in the Yellow Sea, or the West Sea, as it is known in South Korea. So let's take us to that issue there, and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and just how difficult it is to draw this line, and what the big issue is about trying to draw a boundary here.
So the two countries, China and South Korea, have overlapping EEZ claims. And the
I should get you to mention just what an EEZ is. I think some people might. Yep.
Sure. It's the exclusive economic zone, where in UNCLOS, or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, all maritime states are able to claim a 200 nautical mile EEZ, or exclusive economic zone, where within that area, they control the resources that are within that 200 nautical miles. So fishing, any sort of oil and gas or other mineral resources that are part of that. It's not a territorial sea, because that goes only to 12 nautical miles, but the EEZ is out to 200 nautical miles, where again, you control the resources, fishing, and again, minerals that are part of that. In the Yellow Sea area, or the West Sea area, as you know, the Koreans refer to it, there is an overlapping EEZ claims based on the width of the area. And China and South Korea have tried to settle sort of how to come to some agreement on how to manage that overlap. And South Korea's position is that the decision, the line should be drawn based on what's known as a median line principle, that you sort of take the two claims out, you draw the line down the middle, roughly so, and one side is South Korea and one side is China, so that you sort of split the difference, if you will, as a median line principle. But China maintains that because it has a larger coastline and has a larger population, that it should have a larger share of that EEZ. And so South Korea and China have had a number of meetings to try to settle that, and have been unable to come up with a formal agreement on how to settle those overlapping EEZ claims. The fishing issue has been managed through a series of interim agreements to try to establish quotas and limits, et cetera, for fishing and fishing zones, et cetera. That has been fairly good at managing some of those issues, but there has been a real problem with Chinese fishing vessels along that northern limit line. And the South Korean Coast Guard has gotten into a number of scraps with Chinese fishing boats, trying to keep them away from South Korean zones. It has gotten violent on a number of occasions. My understanding is that the level of Chinese violations have decreased somewhat over 6 or 7 years ago. It is still a problem and still part of that issue. I think there is also a concern that as Chinese naval power grows, as China seeks to assert its interests in the Yellow Sea, that South Korea may increasingly be at a disadvantage. And they're concerned about that. And I think that's part of their naval development as well, to be able to sort of hold their own, to be sure that these kinds of settlements that will hopefully come in the years ahead will not be forced on South Korea, and they will be able to maintain their interests to the degree possible with China.
What type of legal footing are China on in making that claim to say that because of the larger population and larger land border, they are entitled to a larger economic zone in the sea? Do they have a legal ground into that for that, or is it simply something that they're pushing simply in their own self-interest?
I will have to confess that I am not an international law expert, and particularly on the law of the sea issues. But my understanding is that it is a bit of a stretch that China is trying to push this argument, and that the median line principle tends to be the more dominant path for addressing some of these issues. But again, there could be another answer to that, but I will confess to not being the expert on that issue.
There is one extra thing you spoke about, illegal fishing there, and the number that you put in here. Some people may think it sounds like a fairly minor issue, but you're right. In 2014, this was effectively $1.2 billion of wealth taken out of Korea's oceans as a result of this. And you write that there's also a secondary challenge attached to this, because you go on to say that Chinese naval and coast guard vessels have often crossed with their fleets into South Korean waters, all under the guise of policing their fleet. So this represents a military challenge as well, in a way.
Right, and that's, I think, another element of the concern on the South Korean side, that there is that sort of involvement, if you will, by others besides the fishing fleet that can slowly sort of tip the balance in China's favor. But, I think this is an economic issue for South Korea. I think also there is clearly an element of a sustainable maritime ecosystem here, that if you continue to overfish these areas, that you will destroy the maritime economy, not only for South Korea, but for others as well. And I think there's an important broader sustainable fishing grounds issue here that is a part of this, beyond just sort of an immediate economic concern of what South Korea is losing in regards to the illegal fishing that's happening as a result of this.
Something else interesting that you mentioned, and I had no idea about this, but these buoys keep turning up in those Korean waters, and these are Chinese installed buoys inside the Yellow Sea. And you say the first one was discovered in 2014, and there's been a dozen or so that have been picked up since. And the Chinese claim that these are sensors to observe weathers and current and things like this. But there is a much greater fear attached to these buoys, that they may in fact be there to monitor naval traffic, and of course also potentially strengthen Chinese hands for future negotiations about the EEZs.
Yes, and I think there is, again, a concern that this is another element of perhaps an incremental set of incremental actions on China's part to be able to assert greater strength and leverage behind its claims. That is a concern for South Korea. And so, when you put these things together, that makes it even worse in some respects. It's not hard to imagine when you look at a map and you can see the proximity of the Yellow Sea to some of the very important sensitive coastal areas of China, why there is a degree of sensitivity on the Chinese part. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that gets to override South Korea's interests in this area as well, and that there has to be a fair settlement of these overlapping claims according to international law.
Let's move on to this reef that is in dispute and the expansion of the Chinese air defense identification zone. So in 2013, China extends its defense identification zone. And this suddenly brings into question this, I suppose it is a reef, even though it's called an island technically. And this is Socotra Rock. So let's go to that issue there, because there's a lot of challenges surrounding that, and it's not something we tend to see in the media. Dokdo gets a lot of attention, but this seems to be quietly wiped away, and we don't see a lot about this.
Yeah, so this is, again, as you describe it, a reef. So it is not an island, because even at low tide, it still remains submerged, I believe, about 4 to 5 meters. There has been, for a number of years, a dispute between China and South Korea as to whether this reef is under South Korean administration or under Chinese administration. The South Koreans built an ocean research center on this rock, and so it looks like sort of a scaffolding, a large extensive one that supports a helipad as well as a research center. It doesn't have a lot of personnel there at any particular time, but nonetheless is an important research center or station for South Korea to be able to monitor ocean currents, ocean temperatures, storm activity, et cetera, but also very clearly an assertion by South Korea that this is part of their continental shelf, is the argument that they make, and that therefore falls under their administration. China disputes that. They were very unhappy that South Korea built this particular structure on the rocks. But as you noted, very few folks other than Koreans and Chinese knew much at all about this particular issue until in 2013, when China expands its air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, which the main focus that received was in relation to China and Japan and the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. That was the main focus there for most, but Koreans were very quick to notice that this expansion of the Chinese ADIZ also included, as the Koreans call it, Edo, under Chinese administration. Well, it took, I think, probably less than 24 hours for Korea to expand its ADIZ to include Edo, and so that now, they could make that extension of their air defense identification zone. It remains disputed between China and South Korea. There is not much effort, as I can see, to try to settle this. And I don't think China is necessarily willing to push a whole lot other than just perhaps diplomatic concerns about it. And so I think you're likely to see it stay as is, but it is another interesting element of where South Korea sees maritime interests that need to be protected as well.
Let's jump forward into North Korea then. And again, as I mentioned at the start, we did a podcast on the Northern Limit Line, and that is going to become the central part of this particular section as well. So let's wind it back to that moment. And can you give us a brief overview of what the Northern Limit Line is and some of that difficult, very early history about trying to delineate between the two Koreas when you have such a strong and obvious land border, which is the DMZ. And yet when it comes to the oceans, or at least the seas on either side, this becomes a much more complicated thing, and something that seems to be largely overlooked at the time.
Sure. So when the Korean War is winding down, during the armistice talks, there was agreement on a land border, on the military demarcation line, on the DMZ. They could not come to agreement on a maritime border, on what will become known as the Northern Limit Line. The North Koreans were insisting on a 12 nautical mile maritime line. The United States and South Korea were insisting on 3 nautical miles. Now, today, 12 nautical miles is the standard, and North Korea would have been consistent with that today. But at the time, 3 nautical miles was the limit. I should also say that if you can pull up a map, there are 5 islands that are called the Northwest Islands along that western area as well. And so the armistice is concluded. No one was going to hold up the armistice for the lack of a maritime boundary. But it became pretty clear after the armistice was concluded that there needed to be a maritime boundary drawn. And so the United Nations Command, we think, drew the line halfway between the North Korean shore and these 5 Northwest islands that the armistice named specifically as being under United Nations command and, of course, today South Korean control. And that line is the northern limit line. And there's also a line that's drawn on the east side, but that doesn't have quite the same issue as the northern limit line on the West Sea side. But we can talk about the east side later as well if you would like. But so that line was drawn essentially as a way to try to keep South Korean fishing boats, the U.S., any other boats from the southern side, from crossing the line and restarting hostilities. But again, the line was drawn unilaterally. North Korea was not notified of the line, although clearly they figured out that there was some sort of a maritime boundary here. And there have been clashes along the northern limit line, most notably in 1999 and 2002, 2009, and then again in 2010 when the Chonan was sunk. And South Korea, from their perspective, this is the de facto maritime boundary between North and South Korea. The North Koreans argue that this line is illegitimate. They drew their own line, which is different from what the South Koreans insist on and what the northern limit line is. And while there has been some discussion about perhaps redrawing the line, making this a peace zone, etc., until the security situation improves between North and South Korea, it's unlikely that there is going to be much change here, at least in the near term.
As you mentioned there, you spoke about the eastern side. Let's go there. What are the issues across the Eastern Sea?
Well, if you look at that line, it is probably drawn in this particular case to South Korea's disadvantage. It should probably angle a bit farther to the north if you were going to follow the median line principle that I had mentioned in the UNCLOS agreement. But South Korea is not going to complain about this line because they have less at stake on that line than they do on the western side with the northern limit line. But that would be something that might be on the table if all of these issues were put together in one central sort of negotiation effort.
What are apart from military clashes, I have to assume there's a significant problem also with illegal fishing as well.
Yes, and that's why this line is such an important issue. I mean, there are security issues certainly here that from a South Korean perspective, if you adjust that line and it would come farther south, there have been some different proposals that have been made in regards to what a redrawn northern limit line might look like. But security is one element of that it would allow, if it were redrawn, the North Korean Navy would be closer to South Korean shores, and that would be a concern. But fishing is also a key piece to this. It's a rich fishing grounds. In particular, the blue crab are often cited as a very important resource in that area. And North Korea argues that they are being restricted from fishing grounds that would be accessible to them if the northern limit line were drawn differently and, in their view, more legitimately. There also are issues in regards to North Korean ships. If they are traversing from ports there, they have to go to the north and up and around the northern limit line before they can exit into the Yellow Sea to be able to access other ports. Now, of course, that is an issue these days because of sanctions and such, so there's a limit to what can actually be shipped and brought in that way, at least legally, according to sanctions. But that's another piece to this. So it's really about security, it's about fishing, it's about shipping. And those things are all important elements for both countries, depending on which of these lenses you are using to look at.
And with all these negotiations, and we should mention recently, the 2018 at the Panmunjom Peace Declaration between Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in, this resurfaces as an issue. It then resurfaces in the same year, in September 19th, as it was part of the comprehensive military agreement signed there. And yet, as with many things North Korea, it seems to get spoken about a lot, and we seem to be no close to a resolution. Or how do you see that?
Yes, and I think you can go back even farther to 2007 when Roh Moo-hyun had his summit meeting with Kim Jong-il, and there was some discussion about whether the Northern Limit Line would be examined during those meetings as well. And it's interesting, some of the same language, some of the same types of proposals were carried over to 2018 and 2019, et cetera. One of them is the possibility of joint fishing zones so that both South Korean and North Korean vessels could fish in certain areas. Also, given the military clashes that have happened along the Northern Limit Line, a great deal of concern that these kinds of things don't happen again, because for all of our focus on Korean security, we again are focused on the land story here, and certainly rightly so. But when you look at the maritime zones, sailors have been killed, ships have been sunk. There has been a lot of violence in these particular areas, and yet again it doesn't receive quite the same attention. And so trying to make sure that there is no repeat of some of these clashes that occurred in 99 and 2002, 2010, et cetera, that's another important area that needs attention in regards to the Northern Limit Line. But despite these different times when it has been proposed to try to have something formal put in place, there has been relatively little progress made in regards to anything sort of permanent or concrete in those areas, other than perhaps trying to improve hotlines and communication between the North and South. There just has not been much progress in that area. But again, I have often said, if we are going to look for flashpoints on the Korean Peninsula, the maritime zone is often one that is overlooked and I think needs much more attention.
I really hope you're enjoying this episode of the podcast, and I apologize for this interruption, but I'm just going to take this moment to remind our listeners that we've made a conscious decision here in the Korean App Podcast not to run advertising in any way. So if you do enjoy the podcast, and you listen regularly, and you do want it to continue, it is important that you do your best to support us at the links below, or by sharing, liking, or commenting on the podcast across social media. All your help in this regard is invaluable. And now back to the episode. Let's talk about Japan then. And again, this is one of those issues that the maritime issues tend to get overlooked, even though a lot of attention is on them, but they tend to get overlooked in light of historical arguments and law cases and lawsuits about comfort women and forced laborers and old crimes from the Second World War and Imperial Japan. But let's start with, again, a historical overlap from that. And this is moment in 2018 in October. And this is where South Korea and the South Korean Navy insist that Japan not fly the Rising Sun on its warships. This seems to many people seem like not a strange issue, but an issue that they never would have thought would have any significance today in some ways. So let's go to that particular moment in 2018 and this debate about this and just how significant it is or is not.
Well, and I think as you described a number of the issues that led up to this, these last 2, 3, 4 years have been very tough years for Korea-Japan relations for a number of different reasons. And you mentioned several of those issues. The Rising Sun Ensign issue, I still am not entirely sure why this became an issue at that particular point, because it certainly is not the first time that Japan and South Korean navies have worked together in the past and such. But as part of that overall context, it became a point of concern. And when Korea asked Japan not to fly that ensign, as when the Japanese ships would participate in this fleet exercise, the Japanese Navy just said, well, we're not going to come. And so they didn't. And that adds to some of the other issues that you mentioned in regards to the comfort women, the forced labor issues, et cetera, and how those things all evolved.
The major issue between Japan and South Korea, of course, is these rocky little islands that South Koreans call Dokdo and the Japanese call Takeshima. So let's jump into that thorny little issue there and let's talk about that. So what is the significant historical debates about these particular islands?
Well, so I think while historians from both Japan and South Korea go way back to look at old maps and other documentary evidence to secure or to demonstrate their position that either South Korea or Japan had sovereignty over these islands, I think the key starting point is in 1905, where in January 1905, the Japanese cabinet makes a decision to incorporate Takeshima, as they would call it, as part of Japan. And there are two explanations for this. One, that the Japanese cabinet was simply saying, these islands have always been under our control. They have been sovereign parts of Japanese territory. We are just sort of reasserting that. Others have made an argument that the Japanese government was saying these are, to use the law term, terra nullius, or occupied by no one. And so therefore we're open to Japan laying claim to in this early part of 1905. When World War II comes to an end and Japan is required to give up all the territories that it occupied as a result of World War II and also going back to its occupation of Korea, Japan maintains we occupied these areas before we established a protectorate over South Korea. And so therefore these aren't covered by that. But the South Korean argument is, no, that is not how this works. First of all, they go to great pains to establish how they had sovereignty over these islands long before 1905. So it wasn't terra nullius. These were Korean islands for years. And that this was all part of Japan establishing the protectorate, seizing these territories illegally, and thus were required to give them back at the end of World War II. But to make a very complicated story short, at the end of World War II in the San Francisco Treaty, it was a very sort of muddled process of whether Dokdo or Takeshima would be mentioned specifically in that document to say they stay with Japan or no, they should revert back to Korea. They simply weren't mentioned at all. And it was uncertain what the fate of these islands were. And, you know, there's a US side to this where I think in some respects, Japan was better at lobbying the US government in those years, and Japan was strategically more important to the United States in those years. And so the United States just simply sort of stayed out of this, and it was a real uncertain status of these islands. But in 1954, Syngman Rhee, South Korean president at the time, decided to occupy the islands, and South Korea has continued to occupy those islands. And so from South Korea's perspective, there is no dispute here. These are South Korean, we occupy them. but Japan maintains that these islands are still Japanese territory, and so Japan maintains that there is still a dispute. But this is another one of the issues that are part of Korean-Japan relations that I doubt is going to be settled anytime soon. But the status quo is likely to stay as it is.
Do these islands have any strategic importance, do you think? Because many people will know just how hot this issue is, at least here in South Korea. I'm sure is the same across in Japan. But largely, they at least so far, there doesn't seem to be a lot of natural resources in the adjacent sea to these islands or these rocks, apart from the fisheries themselves. So is there, or do you see any particular strategic importance here?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, if you Google the islands and you see what they look like, there is not much potential to put anything on the islands. The South Koreans, in their occupation, built a pier. They built a couple of facilities there, but that's about it. I believe they have the facilities to house about 50 personnel in barracks on the island, but there's not much else there. However, if you have territory, now you have a territorial sea that's a part of this, and the 12 nautical miles for that. Plus, if these are islands that would generate an EEZ, now you have 200 nautical miles around these islands. And so there is potential for fishing rights to this. There also have been some studies done that suggested there may be some oil and gas reserves within the area. So there are some economic implications to this. However, I would suggest to you that even if there was not a fish within 200 nautical miles of these islands, I think they would still be very, very important to Koreans in particular, because these islands are part of the history questions. And I think from a Korean perspective, this is very much tied to some unsettled historical issues and goes well beyond any sort of economic piece to this. Let me add one other economic potential point to this. In 2016, when China and the Philippines had their court case decided by an international tribunal in the South China Sea, the ruling reemphasized that in UNCLOS, for an island to generate a 200 nautical mile EEZ, it must be able to sustain life on its own. That was applied to the different features that were in the South China Sea that were part of this case. But many analysts have also said that would probably apply to the Dokdo Takeshima issue as well, and that those islands cannot sustain life on their own. And so whether they would actually generate in international maritime law a 200 nautical mile EEZ is questionable. And so they may be limited to just a 12 nautical mile EEZ. But of course, we are a long way from having to worry about any sort of issue in that regard.
What about the I suppose war games, an appropriate term. What about the war games that South Korea conducts around these islands each year? So each year the South Korean Navy conducts these naval exercises, effectively showing their willingness to defend the islands. Is this, do you think, again, something for domestic politics, or is there some real commitment to defending the islands in a military conflict?
Well, I think it's some of all of those things, but let me just say the likelihood again of Japan mounting any sort of effort to retake those islands, I think is almost zero. But Japan will continue to reassert its claim to the islands as it does regularly in its defense white papers. South Korea does the same, and that's always an occasion for both sides to reassert and probably recall their ambassadors to demonstrate that. But I think from a South Korean perspective, it is not only domestic politics, but it is their way of making a very clear statement that these islands are theirs, their sovereign territory. They will defend it, and is part of that political statement to that broader audience as well. But again, the likelihood that that's ever going to have to be asserted is another issue. But let me just add one other point to this, which is an intriguing part of the last couple of years of bringing China and Russia into this. We have seen over the last couple of years, China and Russia begin to conduct more joint exercises in these particular areas. And in 2019, in particular, the Chinese and Russians had several planes fly within the ADIZs of Korea and Japan, and also get close to Dokdo or Takeshima, and even cross within the airspace of that 12 nautical miles. And I think that China and Russia knew exactly what they were doing in this particular case, because they knew they would get a reaction not only from South Korea, but also from Japan, and that would help exacerbate the tensions already in place between Japan and South Korea. Because one of the things that China very much wants to see not happen is closer Korean, Japanese, and US relations in a sort of trilateral semi-defense arrangement, and exacerbating these kinds of tensions, I think, are issues, is exactly what was intended. And I think they got their response from Korea and from Japan.
Now, that is an interesting point. And I have to assume, I think I bumped into this somewhere reading through your research this past week, that there is also a concern here for Japan that even if they didn't care so much about Dokdo Takeshima and they're willing to give it up, they wouldn't be able to, or it'd be a very difficult thing to do regardless, because they are also in island disputes with China and Russia, and showing the willingness to compromise here or to give up land would also damage their ability to hold on to those islands that they're in dispute with those two large nations.
Yes, and I think too, just to touch on one other issue that's related, I think for both sides, the domestic to try to quote unquote settle this issue would require some compromise on both sides. But for both parties, any sort of compromise is just a non-starter in regards to domestic politics. And so the cost of any sort of settlement that would require that is way too high for either country. And again, as I mentioned, from South Korea's perspective, there is no dispute here to settle. But as well from Japan, to have any sort of compromise, the domestic politics there would be too difficult. And so the cost of the dispute as it is tolerable for both sides in that regard. But from the Japanese perspective, you raise another important element here that I think is crucial here. Japan has more than one island dispute. It has a set of island disputes with the Russians, this one with Korea, and then of course it has the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. I think in many respects, Japan sees these linked, and that even if Japan decided, this just isn't worth it, we're going to concede to the Korean position and give up our claims on this, I think Japan feels that move would have an effect on their other island disputes that might perhaps send a message to China, to Russia, that eventually Japan can be convinced, coerced, pushed, whatever word you want to use, into giving up on its claim. And so I think that for those reasons, I think Japan sees these three island disputes interconnected, and therefore is going to have a hard time moving in any other direction than maintaining this. And, we had another indication of this a number of weeks ago where the United States hosted a trilateral meeting between Japan and South Korea. And my understanding is the meeting went very well in regards to talking about the common security issues that they have in regards to dealing with North Korea. And that's what's so important, I think, for all sides to remember are those common interests and where those things can still be worked on. But at around that same time, the South Korean chief of national police visited Dokdo. Japan complained about that and felt they could not meet in the press conference that followed after this. South Korea didn't participate either. And so that was an unfortunate ending to that apparent progress on talking about the North Korean issue.
Let's talk about the East Sea or the Sea of Japan. Now, as we mentioned earlier, we spoke about the Yellow Sea or the West Sea, and this doesn't get much attention because, of course, it's China and not Japan. And Japan seems to rattle the attentions when it comes to Korea a lot more. So what is the issue around the naming of that sea that lies between the two countries?
Well, of course, if you pull up a map of that region, you can tell almost immediately whether the source of that map was Korean or not, whether it is labeled the East Sea or whether it is labeled the Sea of Japan. This also goes back to, I believe it is around 1929, when the International Hydrographic Organization tried to, as an international body, tried to standardize the names of various bodies of water. And that area was labeled the Sea of Japan. It was relabeled or labeled the same in a 1937 version of this document that they produced. 1953, again, it was labeled the Sea of Japan. Koreans will argue that in 29 and 37, we were under Japanese occupation, so we could not object to that particular naming as being an unfair indication of Japanese sovereignty over this or whatever over this particular area. 1953, the Korean War was just coming to an end, and South Korea was not part of the International Hydrographic Organization yet. And so since that time, South Korea has sought to try to have this name changed either to the East Sea, which they argue is much more of a neutral sort of name, or at least to have both Sea of Japan and East Sea included on international maps. But they have been rebuffed at most points in trying to do that, although I believe last November, the IHO decided to move to a labeling approach that used numbers instead of names. But the United States has, as formal policy, stayed with Sea of Japan, as it has a formal position that it will not use more than one name for any particular feature like that. And Sea of Japan has been the one historically that has been used and will stay with that. I should also say as well, just to go back to the Dokdo Takeshima issue as well, the United States position on sovereignty in that issue, as well as most other island disputes in the Asia-Pacific region, is that the United States does not take a formal position on the sovereignty, that those disputes are up to the claimants to settle, but to settle those peacefully. And likewise with Dokdo Takeshima, making this even more sensitive since these are two very valued U.S. alliances. The U.S. government does not take a formal position on sovereignty.
Let me ask a silly question of someone of your position and your history here. Why can't there be two names for the one sea? Because this is something that Korea have put forward. As you mentioned, America, the American response was we only accept one name on our maps. But why is this such an issue?
You know, I don't know for certain and I would imagine there's probably a more detailed answer to this, but my guess is that it is simply that if the United States would argue that if it accepts every dispute where there are multiple names, the map would get quite busy. And so for simplicity's sake, it simply maintains that it will only go with one name for these different features. I think that's probably the answer, and I'm roughly remembering seeing that in a particular explanation. But I think that's largely it, that otherwise you could have multiple bodies of water and features and such where there could be multiple names on a particular map, and that would complicate matters. Now, of course, that's not very satisfactory to the countries who are in dispute, but I think that's the explanation of why that's been U.S. policy.
We should mention one last thing on Japan before we get to some final questions, and that is the issue of what are now overlapping air defense identification zones.
Yes, and so, that hasn't been a major issue, but it certainly also, can be a potential problem. Of course, one of the things that many mistake is that air defense identification zones are not territorial airspace. These are designations that some countries make, not every country does, where it is a air zone that extends out X number of miles, where states maintain that they have the ability to monitor and respond to aircraft that enter those zones, because you have to, if they could be hostile, intercept them farther out than you would normally with territorial airspace. And so they are, as the name implies, an air defense tool, if you will. They are not formal international law concepts, but a number of states do have an ADIZ. Japan and South Korea also have an ADIZ, and they overlap in some spots, but so far it has not been something that has been a problem. But of course, there's always that potential, but hopefully that will continue to be managed in a way that doesn't lead to a problem.
Let's finish up with a few questions in the broader look on the South Korean maritime question, and particularly the South Korean Navy. In 2001, Kim Dae-jung, as president, said South Korea needs to develop an ocean-going Navy. Let's start there, because many people do know that South Korea committed a huge amount of resources towards building its own shipyards and its own shipbuilding industry, but they may not be aware of what South Korean Navy looked like and what it looks like today, or what the importance of an ocean-going Navy is. So let's go to that issue there, and just what South Korean's Navy actually looks like today, and why an ocean-going Navy is an important thing for a nation like South Korea.
Well, and I want to start by just saying I think the expansion of the South Korean Navy has been just a phenomenal story. The capabilities that they have built, the types of ships that they have built over these last few decades has just been phenomenal. And as you note, all of them built from or in South Korean shipyards. Some of the weapon systems have to be purchased from U.S. manufacturers, but the ships themselves built in South Korea, and their technology, their expertise, even in some of the weapon systems, is expanding. And again, an amazing story of South Korean growth. I think it is part and parcel with our earlier discussion of how South Korea's interests are broadening, that given its dependence on maritime shipping lanes, the need to be able to protect those interests has grown. As South Korea has become a growing middle power, states together have had to band together to be able to protect maritime commerce. And so by having this level of a naval capability, South Korea is able to join in some of those different efforts. And the most noteworthy one is the Combined Task Force 151, which South Korea contributes a destroyer to, that is patrolling for counter-piracy operations off the Horn of Africa. South Korea's growing naval capability allows it to participate there as well as in other areas, and to be able to be much more of a regional naval player, which I think is important. Now, one of the criticisms that is often leveled, and certainly was part of this discussion earlier as South Korea grew its ocean-going naval capability, and that is that, come on, you look at South Korea's security challenges, it's about coastal defense, it's about North Korea. And so why devote the resources to that? I think there's a balance to be had here, and I think South Korea has done a pretty good job of striking that balance. It has built a respectable and capable ocean-going navy, but that hasn't come at the expense of coastal defense. While it is building ocean-going destroyers, large deck amphibs, it is also building new lines of frigates and coastal patrol vessels as well. And so I think South Korea is striking a good balance between those different capabilities. Now, two questions that are still being debated in South Korea, and the wisdom of this, is whether South Korea should continue forward with building its light aircraft carrier and also building a nuclear-powered submarine. Is that the best place for South Korea to devote its naval budgets for? And, I think there is still some disagreement about that. It looks like South Korea is going forward with the aircraft carrier. I think the nuclear submarine may still be a point of debate, but again, there is still some argument about whether that is the right place. But nonetheless, overall, I think South Korea is doing a good job of balancing the competing priorities that it has in maritime security in a number of these different domains.
Well, you mentioned nuclear submarines, and they're a hot topic in the news these days with the recent AUKUS deal between America, Britain, and Australia. And so I can't leave you without asking a question about that, because you wrote an article which I bumped into this week reading up on for the podcast, where you spoke about when the previous American President Trump, when he visited South Korea, he spoke about selling nuclear submarines to South Korea. And as you mentioned there, South Korea talking about building their own as well. And your title for that piece was Nuclear Submarines for South Korea Not Worth the Cost. And so let's go into that, because for many people, I'm Australian, I follow Australian news, and everyone in Australia gets very excited about the talk about nuclear submarines. It seems to be a large upgrade. But you go into detail here about perhaps, at least for a country like South Korea, this is just not the most important thing.
Yes, and I certainly acknowledge that there are different points to argue on this, and that it is not a complete argument on one side of this issue or another. I think there are elements on both sides to consider. But my main argument is that what a nuclear submarine gives you is the ability to be submerged, to be able to operate submerged for longer periods of time. Again, as an important reminder, this is not South Korea developing nuclear weapons. This is about the nuclear power that would allow a submarine to stay submerged for lengthy periods of time, be able to dwell much longer. If in those particular cases, those submarines, what forces them to surface is really when the crew runs out of food. Otherwise, they can submerge for long, long periods of time. They're also costly submarines to be able to build and maintain. I'm not sure that's where South Korea's underwater needs are most met. This North Korean threat, I think, could be met in a much better way with more diesel boats that they could build more of at a cheaper cost, and that would be a better direction than the more expensive, though certainly more capable, nuclear submarines. But again, I certainly understand that there are arguments on both sides of this question, but I think I lean in the other direction.
As a last question, of course, the American administration hands over from Trump to Biden, and we're still with this lingering question, I think from 2020, but at least from, I think it was, in fact, Shinzo Abe who first brought it up, and this is the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific region. So how committed do you think America are to this still? And how committed should South Korea be as a loyal ally of America in this issue itself? And of course, that comes to a broader question of South Korea being pinched between the major powers of China and America. So a very broad question there to end things off on.
Sure. And I think a very important question. I think the United States is still absolutely committed to the notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific, a rules-based regional order, as well as another way that you hear that phrased. And to add another piece to what you mentioned in your question is the Quad and South Korea's possible membership or participation in some sort of Quad plus arrangement in the future. And you pointed to the very difficult strategic dilemma that South Korea finds itself in, and that is its number one security partner with the United States and the important, close, long-term relationship that the U.S. and South Korea have, but with the other side of the coin, the important economic ties that South Korea has with China. China is there, it's not going anywhere. And so while the alliance is crucial and an important relationship, South Korea also has to be careful to manage its relationship with China. And it's interesting, you are seeing this sort of come into focus in regards to this Quad discussion. And I've been a part of a number of different webinars, sat in on some different webinars where this is debated between different US and South Korean analysts as well. And I hear some South Korean analysts saying, absolutely, our interests lie with the United States. We should join the Quad. To others saying, no, it's a mistake. To perhaps the more consensus view, at least at the moment, is South Korea has a lot of important interests that can be supported by the whole notion of a free and open Indo-Pacific, rules-based international order, free trade, those kinds of things that the Quad stands for, but that joining it formally can be a problem, particularly if the Quad ends up becoming something that looks like an anti-China balancing coalition. And so I think what you are seeing now, certainly in the Moon Jae-in administration, is not formally joining the Quad, but trying to participate where it can in some of the different elements of activities. For example, vaccinations are one. I think some elements of maritime security can be part of that, not focused on China issues. And so I think South Korea, you are likely to see participate where it can, but to see how the whole Quad arrangement plays out, because I think it's not entirely clear what the Quad ends up looking like in, say, the next 5 to 10 years as well. So the short answer is South Korea is in a tough spot. And I think it has to do the best it can to manage that relationship. And it's not going to be easy. And certainly if U.S.-China relations continue to deteriorate, that's going to get even trickier.
And that is a great thoughtful point to end the podcast on. Below the podcast, I'm going to link, I'm going to provide a few links to not just Terence's books, but also Terence's articles, which I read throughout the week as background research for the podcast. And also the links to the 2 previous podcasts that I conducted with Terence. And I really can't encourage listeners enough to go and read and listen to those for themselves. Terence, thanks again. It is such a rare pleasure. Thanks for speaking to us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jed. This is always fun.